Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. With all the things going on in the world, I have decided that I'll pretty much deal with that kind of stuff on Fridays still. I want to continue my little Bible study here, my Skeptics Disharmony of the Gospels, called The Tall Tale of Jesus. I want to continue on going through the harmony of the Gospels, as I would have when I was a preacher. I have taught the life of Christ probably 4 or 5 times in my various churches, and this time, though, I'm doing it as a skeptic, as somebody who no longer believes the account. I am going to try to give the account the benefit of the doubt as much as possible, much like I would have when I was a preacher. But at the same time, I'm going to try to point out that there are certain things that are just straight up irreconcilable. And one of the problems that I'm going to address today is that on occasion, the gospel writers do indeed tell you what their purpose is. And their purpose often creates an understanding that they are indeed biased, that they're not looking at the information from a skeptic's point of view, but they're looking at it from a person who believes, and therefore their opinion is biased based on that simple understanding. As we head through the Gospels and we go through these things, we're going to see every once in a while, much like Luke here does, create this, idea of this is why I'm writing. Now, I want to remind everybody, I'm conceding to the conservatives that Luke, the beloved physician, did indeed write this book. I'll concede the time frame that it's probably 63-ish to 65-ish AD, depending on who you talk to. Some people have as early as 55, some people as late as 70 on the conservative side, but I'm going to concede the conservative dating too, although I think there's a pretty good case to be made that the dating is later. And that was one of the problems I ran into as a biblical scholar, is running into this constant problem of people ignoring the fact that there was good evidence to suggest that the Gospels were a little older than what the conservatives were claiming. But I'm conceding all that. So let's take a look at what Luke actually says is his purpose. Okay. Luke 1, verses 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and the servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. This is a very general statement of purpose. Even the name Theophilus is very general. It means lover of truth or lover of God, actually lover of God. And so the assumption is that the reader is a believer. The assumption is that they have been taught different things about Jesus and about their beliefs and about God. And so there's an assumption behind this purpose that, the person who is reading this already believes. I would submit to you that this, where the other evangelists, I think, are pretty clearly trying to evangelize. That is, they're trying to proselytize. Luke seems to be more resigned to establishing what he considers to be the truth of what people have been taught. He's more interested in sound doctrine through what he believes to be sound history. This is why a lot of conservative scholars say that he is the historian of the gospel writers, because he's just basically trying to get the facts in order. Things. He even says that, it seems fitting for me as well, having investigated everything from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order. Now that phrase a little bit, I'm going to talk about that, has its own problems, but his purpose seems to be, I want to put things down in order so that you will know the truth of what you've been taught. Okay. Now, there's a few things in this thing that we have to acknowledge. The first thing he says is, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a account of things accomplished among us. Boy, is he not whistling Dixie about that. There are tons of early gospels of Jesus Christ, most of them just the teachings of Christ. There, by this time, according to what I'm thinking, whether you do an old or new or younger dating method, what you deal with, in my opinion, is that you also have Mark and Matthew have written before Luke, and that it's pretty clear to a lot of us who have looked at the Bible, looked at the original text in any cursory way, that, you know, both Luke and Matthew are using Mark for sure, because there's a lot of overlap. But there's also this other source that they call Q that Luke and Matthew are using. Now, Matthew only writes slightly ahead of Luke, so I often wonder if there was like a second round of gospel writing after the first round, where as the faith got older, they wanted these stories that they were spreading around by oral tradition to be more established. I've heard several things saying, you know, these writers aren't constrained by anything when they sit down to write. Oh, yes, they were. They were constrained by the oral tradition that was already in existence that people would accept. They couldn't just go off and just make up stuff completely. They had to use the oral traditions that existed in order to give their gospel credibility among the common people. So they wouldn't have done that. You know, so he's acknowledging that many other people have tried to compile an account of the things accomplished among them. And then in verse 2, he acknowledges that these things have been handed down without really being written down, just as they were handed down to us from those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Okay, so what he's saying is that what has been handed down is from people who were eyewitnesses of the events and that they were servants of the word. There's a twofold problem with this. Number one, even if they were eyewitnesses of the events, eyewitnesses make the worst testimony, because we have now looked at, you know, psychologically, and we have data to back this up. Eyewitnesses are terrible when it comes to establishing the facts of things. Trust me, prosecutors are far more thankful that there are a lot of cameras around, because if you left it to the accounts of people, certain things change depending on the person's perspective. But eyewitnesses don't necessarily mean that the truth of what they say is true. That's why the whole expression, which I am using as a critique of this, and I will in a minute, when I get to next week, when I talk about the visitations of the angels to Zacharias and Mary, I want you to understand that eyewitness accounts are terrible to prove, and they're often conflictatory. In fact, when in the Gospels, we do have conflict in the four Gospels themselves about certain events, that things aren't always as true and right as people think they are. But then he offers this, and they were servants of the word. In other words, there's a emotional appeal here that they were believers just like us, and they dedicated themselves to the cause of Jesus Christ, to Christianity. And so therefore they're more believable. This is a blatant appeal to authority by Luke, that what he is writing is based on the authority of people that were supposed eyewitness of the events. You're dealing with faulty evidence on eyewitnesses, and you're also making an appeal to authority, which isn't facts or evidence. It's just an appeal to authority. Authorities can be wrong. And so it doesn't, you know, just because somebody has authority or office power doesn't mean that they're infallible. And so, you know, we're going to see some of that fallibility as we continue through the study. But at this point, I just want to point out that just because they were servants of the word doesn't mean that they were more truthful. There have been plenty of cult leaders that have claimed to be servants of God and servants of the world when they were far from truthful. Truthfulness has to be established in establishing truth. There's criteria for establishing something as factual or true, and that's what needs to be covered here. The Gospels most of the time grossly fail in that. And right out of the gate, Luke's claim is that basically he's writing down the testimony of eyewitnesses who were servants of God in order to preserve this record for the people of God. So it really is written to people that already believe, okay, and they want to know the full or complete story of Jesus, okay, and that's his claim. And then verse 3, he says, "It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus." Now, we need to understand that this doesn't sound like somebody who believes that they're writing something that's the inspired word of God. It seemed fitting for me as well. It just seems like, maybe it's a good idea for me to write down all this stuff just to make sure that, you can understand what's going on and how things are established. And then he said, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning. I'm left with that phrase to assume that his methods of investigation were adequate, at least to his estimation. But that's the problem, isn't it? Would his criteria of investigation stand up today? And the answer is probably no. In historical research, you have to document several sources, and you have to get more than just eyewitness testimony. There has to be archaeological evidence. There has to be good literature evidence most of the time. There has to be more than eyewitnesses. There sometimes can be physical evidence to a historical event. And these are things that you need to testify. History is often established by the fact that this person over in Italy writes about it, this person in Africa writes about it, this person in Russia writes about this person. A person's identity is often established by the fact of contemporaries that knew him or her and wrote in different places about their existence. And hostile witnesses, even more so, tend to help establish the existence of a person. So we don't really have that here. What Luke is basically telling us is I've investigated things by a method that I refuse to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Now, maybe they didn't think it was important because they're writing to believers. And because they're writing to believers, that's a weakness of this gospel. Because Luke doesn't go to great lengths to prove his point. He just says so at the beginning of this, that I've investigated everything carefully and I'm going to write everything down from the beginning. Now, it's that last part that causes another problem, because Luke's claim in his gospel is not that he just found certain events of Jesus Christ, his life, and events that surrounded that life. He is claiming that he wrote everything down in the consecutive order in which the events happen. Now, as we are going to see as we go through this harmony of the Gospels, if I take that as true, there's going to be some things that really, really don't make sense. This is why a lot of harmony of the Gospels people use Luke as a basis because of this claim. And therefore, they try to fit the other Gospels onto Luke. That doesn't always work. The better way is actually to fit everything to Mark. And then the things that stand outside of Mark usually fit better from a literature standpoint. But that's not the claim of Luke. Luke is saying, I've investigated, and it's almost like he's saying to the other Gospels, you guys got some things wrong, and I put it back in the right order. If that's the case, then that's kind of undercuts any other Gospels that were written before his credibility. Once again, Theophilus just means lover of God. Very general term. I think it's actually not a real person. I think it's just anybody who picked up the book and said, hey, I'm a lover of God. Here's the accounts you've heard from the beginning. In verse 4, his claim is so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Now, what this implies is that there was a lot of BS going on. And that would include Matthew and Mark, okay, in that this might be wrong. You can't dismiss them simply because they're already established canon. At this time, they weren't. And what Luke is basically claiming here, in an offhand way and a backwards way, is that up until now, nobody's really written the exact truth of what people have been taught. What they've written is their own account. And what Luke is claiming here is I'm going to extra links to give you the exact truth of what you've been taught in consecutive order. This is actually going to cause a lot of problems down the road, but I want you to remember Luke's claim, because as we go forward through the life of Christ, as we go forward through at times Luke's claim is that he is A, more truthful than other accounts, and B, that his account is in consecutive order. We're going to see how that plays out, because now he's added another level of criteria for me when it comes to his own claims. We will not get to other gospel writers' claims till later in the book. John writes his purpose statements almost at the end. So we need to understand that at this point, Luke has established his purpose to put things truthfully and in consecutive order, and we'll see how that pans out. Now, the judgment of this passage. Is there 2 or 3 witnesses? Well, we're told by Luke that he investigated everything carefully from the beginning, but he never makes the claim that he had 2 or 3 witnesses. He does make the claim of eyewitnesses, which is more than one witness, but that's speaking very generally. Each and every event, in my opinion, needs to be asked the criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses. So at least here, though, with Luke, what we have is somebody making the claim that he investigated everything from the beginning, and that he's trying as best he can to put an orderly, consecutive order account of what happened. And I find that very interesting. Of the gospel writers, none of the rest of them try to do that. They just start writing about Jesus' life. But Luke seems fit to say, this is my purpose. Now, when you get to the book of Acts, he will once again address Theophilus, and he will say, my former treatise, which is this gospel, and then he starts to talk about the Acts of the Apostles. So this is kind of also telling us it's a volume 1 that probably maybe he thought he was going to write a second account, but maybe he didn't. So this gospel was probably designed to stand alone, and then the Acts of the Apostles became a supplement to it, an addition, to kind of tell you what the rest of the story was. So that's kind of where now. Does it make sense? Well, there's a lot of weaknesses here. Number 1, we're never told who these eyewitnesses are. We have to conjecture them. It would have been really helpful at this point if he had listed off those who were beginning were eyewitnesses. But he says they're just eyewitnesses and they're servants of the word, which means whatever stories they told me, I'm going to accept because they're the authority, and I'm going to write them down in order. This is really kind of an appeal to authority and an appeal to our trust of Luke to write the account accurately by himself. There's a reason why there's a peer review process for everything else. There's a reason why you have to prove everything to other witnesses, and you have to bring in more evidence just than your own investigation. Yes, you can do your own investigation and put it in a paper, but then other people are going to take what you wrote, investigate further, and see whether or not what your claim is holds up. So this is kind of what Luke's claim is. Luke's claim is that he is writing everything carefully from the beginning. After investigating it, he's putting it out in consecutive order so you will know the exact truth of the things you've been taught. He's making the claim, the ultimate claim he's making, is that his account is completely and utterly true. We'll see how that pans out. Once again, I would like to welcome you to my channel. Comments have a way of influencing the content of Friday videos, and I will respond to comments when I can. You can also ask direct question anytime if you're looking to understand something, and you can always suggest things you'd like me to do. Videos are uploaded every Tuesday and Friday. One thing I won't tolerate is name calling in the comments section. If you want to demonstrate somebody's a fool or an idiot, or that their idea is a bad one, demonstrate it. Don't say you're an idiot or a fool. Just demonstrate it. I'm very much taking a stand against the venom that often accomplishes comment sections with YouTube videos, and I just don't think it's productive, and it's also a very low form of argumentation. Be sure to like and subscribe and get your notification bell set the way you want it, and hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd the Rabid Atheist signing off and wishing you a good day.